So we now move to our first plenary panel. The United States, as I mentioned, stand at a pivotal moment in history as two of the world's largest democracies. Their collaboration spans research, business, policy, and global security, among many other things. This session will explore how the relationship is evolving and what strategic priorities and opportunities lie ahead, and how institutions, private enterprise, and civil society can deepen the critical partnership. So I'd like to first welcome our session chair, Mr. Sanjeev Joshipura, who is the Executive Director of Indiaspora and a dear friend. He's a seasoned voice in international affairs and the diaspora engagement. Joining him are three very distinguished speakers. We have Ambassador Arun Singh, who is the Senior Counselor at the Cohen Group and the former Indian Ambassador to the United States. Ms. Sumona Guha, who is a national security expert and former Senior Director for South Asia at the U.S. National Security Council. And last but not least, Ms. Nisha Biswal, who's the former Deputy CEO at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation and Senior Advisor at the Asia Group. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists and session chair to the stage. Thank you, and we look forward to the discussion.
Hello. Yeah, great. Thank you, Amita. It's a pleasure and a privilege for Indiaspora to partner with Johns Hopkins University and the Gupta-Klinsky Institute for this inaugural US-India Conference. The response and the turnout has been just overwhelming, and it's been such a pleasure to work with Amita and Kunal and Nitisha and the entire team there. I also feel about 10 feet tall right now because I'm sitting next to three eminent people who are such distinguished experts in their field. And also, as I've gotten to engage with them and know them over the years, just wonderful people to interact with. So it's a delight for me to be moderating this particular panel. I know that their bios have already been kind of briefly read out by Amita, so I won't repeat that, but I'll get straight into the topics at hand, the topics for our conversation today. And this panel obviously is about US-India relations broadly writ. Let me start by addressing something that's on all our minds, which is the conflict between India and Pakistan right now. There have been now put in the prism, viewed through the lens of, the American lens. There have been a lot of statements made by senior American officials about the conflict. President Trump has made supportive statements towards India. Secretary Rubio has had numerous conversations with Dr. Jaishankar. The Speaker of the House made some comments about the conflict as well. But then I believe just yesterday, Vice President Vance said, and I quote, "It's none of our business." And so, given these seemingly disparate comments from senior officials in the administration, I just want to pose a question to my distinguished panelists about how they view US engagement or lack thereof in the current conflict. Arun, I'll start with you and then we'll proceed to your left.
Thanks, Sanjeev. So I think just trying to understand what's playing out, clearly the response from India is on account of a major terrorist incident that took place in Pahalgam. And in the Indian assessment, as you know, Pakistan has been involved in sponsoring terrorism against India for more than 4 decades, since the 1980s. And you've had some major terrorist incidents from time to time. There was the attack on Indian Parliament on 13 December 2001, and then there was a mobilization of Indian forces after that. There was an attack in Mumbai in 2008, which went on for 4 days. 10 people had come across from Pakistan over the seas, and more than 160 people had been killed. There was an attack in 2019 in Pulwama. 40 Indian soldiers had lost their lives, and now attack in Pahalgam when 26 civilians have been killed in that. Now, globally, it has been signaled that there is zero tolerance for terrorism. The US reacted in a certain way after 9/11. You are seeing the reaction in Israel after the attack in October 2023. So there is a sense that there should be and there is zero tolerance for terrorism. So I think the reaction is in response to that. Now, as far as the international responses are concerned, I think, as I see it now from outside the government and watching the comments coming out in India, is that the Indian expectation would be that people stand with India as it deals with the challenge of terrorism. And that having been said, India would deal with the issues it faces on its own, based on its own strengths. And India has opposed any third-party intervention on India's issues with any other country, particularly on India-Pakistan issues, and would like to handle it on its own. So that's the broad Indian approach that we have.
Thank you.
Well, when speaking about the U.S. reaction, I'd just like to add that we've seen Secretary of State Marco Rubio reach out to both Indian External Affairs Minister Jaishankar and the Pakistani Prime Minister to encourage direct dialogue between the two countries and encourage de-escalation. And that's very consistent with the U.S. position in the past when these incidents have unfortunately taken place.
Sanjeev, thanks again for inviting me to this wonderful conference and also for the collaboration between Indiaspora, Johns Hopkins. I think it's an important collaboration. I guess the only thing I would add to what's been said, it's obviously a concerning situation anytime there is kinetic activity along the India-Pakistan front. And, you know, the U.S. has long said that it supports the right of India to defend itself against terrorism. But I think what perhaps the Vice President's comments can be taken in the context of is you have a president who kind of ran on the fact that he was going to keep the United States out of wars. And this is an indication, I think, of saying that the United States is not getting kind of dragged into a conflict. And it's kind of making that clear to the American public. And at the same time, I think it has been long the contention of India that any issues between India and Pakistan need to be resolved bilaterally between the two countries, and that it objects to international or third-party mediation. And I think this was perhaps a shorthand way of indicating that the U.S. is not looking to go in and, you know, mediate between the two countries.
You know, as we were all discussing in the green room before we came out, we wanted to make sure that we address the elephant in the room, but not let it suck the oxygen out of the room, because this is a US-India panel broadly writ. It's not about India-Pakistan, and there are so many multiple issues on which, and areas of work on which the US and India talk to each other. And we'll address several of those now in the remaining time of our panel, and then perhaps open it up to the audience if we have time. Let's talk about the other big elephant in the room right now, which is trade. Again, probably everybody in this room knows about the trade dynamics between the US and India right now. Active negotiations, lots of back and forth comments, most of which have been positive by and large from both sides. It appears that India is doing more than what it has previously done to accommodate President Trump's demands on trade. But India will have their own demands too. And given the situation as it is right now, how do you see it playing out? Is a trade accord imminent? What will be broadly the terms of that kind of accord? What sectors would be impacted? Any thoughts about that, Arun?
So if you see the joint statement that was issued in February after the Indian Prime Minister visited the White House, the fourth foreign leader who had invited to the White House, on trade, two things I noticed. One, that the two are committed to do a multi-sectoral free trade agreement and do the first tranche by the fall of this year. Second, they are committed to taking the trade from the current level of $200 billion to $500 billion by 2030. Now, following that, there has been intense engagement between the two sides on trade negotiations. The Indian Commerce Minister was here. After that, Assistant USTR was in India. Then the Chief Indian Negotiator was here with a team of people. They had detailed discussions on sectoral issues. After that, from what I understand, they're committed to do both virtual and in-person discussions. There are more ministerial level meetings are likely soon. You've seen the US Treasury Secretary say that India is among the countries with which US will do the trade agreement, among the first ones that it will be done. President Trump has said that India is moving very fast on the trade negotiations. Pete Navarro has said that India is moving at Trump speed on these negotiations. So obviously there is a determined effort by the two sides to see it done. Because as you know, technically, President Trump should be going to India in the fall for a Quad summit, which is scheduled to be held, but there are no dates. Right. And it would be useful to have something done before that. Linked to that is the fact that in the phase of globalization of trade and production, India feels it lost out. Gained in services, lost out in manufacturing. Manufacturing was sucked away by China, which now has 32% of global manufacturing and 18% of global GDP. So the effort in India today, as I see it, is to plug into this phase of reordering of supply chains that is happening and take advantage of this restructuring so that manufacturing in India can gain and India can build new trading and economic partnerships. So I think that's the effort. And if you saw a couple of days ago, India and UK have finalized a free trade agreement, which is a major indication because that had been under negotiation for 3 years. Right. And now that they finalized it, and from the reports that have come out, UK on 99% of the tariff lines has really reduced the tariffs for imports from India. They're talking of professional services, they're talking of mobility, they're talking of doing something very similar to what you have the totalization agreement in the US. So these are very, very forward-looking major breakthroughs that have happened. It indicates that India is prepared to do trade agreements way beyond its approaches in the past. And I think that's a positive indicator for where the India-US trade discussions are headed.
The American attitude on trade is, I think, creating a large impetus among other countries to now forge agreements between each other. And I guess the India-UK, the rapidity with which it got resolved and finalized is one example of that. But as I move it to Sumona and then to Nisha, just a thought, Arun was talking about supply chains. I read recently that Google, as an example, which had moved a lot of its smartphone manufacturing from China to Vietnam, is now moving it from Vietnam to India. And I guess that's one example of sort of the differential tariffs that the Trump administration is imposing on various countries. But that also leads to a question, which is if one thinks about China plus one, if one is a corporate CEO thinking about supply chain and thinking of a China plus one strategy, is India well placed to be the plus one in the China plus one?
Well, these are questions that I think U.S. industry is certainly contemplating and examining the possibilities. And it's not just Google that has moved operations into India in recent years. You have other major technology companies doing that. But I think there might not be a one-size-fits-all. I think we're in a period where both sides are ready to perhaps consider new questions, new incentives, new modes of cooperation, perhaps new investment incentives on the part of India, perhaps on the part of American industry, a willingness to look broader and do the negotiations needed. And of course, all of this gets wrapped into the very robust conversation that is happening between the US and India on technology cooperation in general. We talked about the joint statement between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump in February. That refers to a range of initiatives for technology cooperation. that encompasses the supply chain question that you were thinking about, that also encompasses several other issues related to cutting-edge technologies. We can come back to that if you want, but I do think that when you talk about supply chains, you now have a very serious and very high-level government-to-government discussion that sort of gives a green light, gives new impetus for industry to explore new modes of cooperation.
So I think what I would add to what Arun and Simona have already said, on a China plus one, I think largely depends on what the global ecosystem and the U.S. tariff policy is. If you're in a world where there's tariffs everywhere, then I think companies are going to double down on cost efficiency. And right now, you can't really beat China on cost efficiency. The extent to which you start having negotiated reductions and bilateral agreements, it creates opportunity for perhaps a shift in manufacturing. The extent to which the US and India get a BTA negotiated, and that India has concluded agreements with other major markets that allow it to have preferential access, India becomes much more attractive, and the cost issue becomes more manageable. So a lot of this, companies are looking to see where things go before they make decisions about whether or not they're shifting supply chains. Google, I think Apple has shifted iPhone manufacturing increasingly to India for the US market, right? And I think you'll see those kinds of shifts. But whole-scale shifts are gonna, they take a lot of time, a lot of thought, a lot of planning. Companies are starting to think about what their strategy is gonna look like, and they're trying to predict what that landscape is gonna look like. And there's still not quite enough certainty about where the administration is going on its tariff policy, but they're starting to see glimmers as you see negotiations get underway, and that will, I think, inform decisions about changes to supply chains.
Simona, you talked about technology, so I do want to move the conversation in that direction. But just before I do that, I do want to keep this very conversational and very informal. So don't only let it necessarily be sort of me guiding and you responding. If you have responses to each other, feel free to engage. I'm sure that our friends in the audience would derive a lot of benefit from that. But on technology, under the Biden administration, there was ISET, which was, a big announcement, and it was an all-of-government initiative headed by the national security advisors on both sides of the equation, involving various cabinet agencies and departments. Now, of course, and I know there's going to be another panel about this later this afternoon about trust. And the question I have for you is it just old wine in a new bottle, ISET and trust? My own reading of the situation, and I'd love your views on it, is that it's more than that. If you look at the joint statement that was released by the two governments after Prime Minister Modi came to America recently, it seemed to expand on what trust, seemed to expand on what ISET had set out to do. Is that a reasonable assessment, or do you have a different point of view?
So ISET, I think first we have to understand what ISET meant. And at a time when the US was imposing technology restrictions in partnership with other countries, here was a signal that the national security advisors of the two countries were stating that on national security grounds, we believe we should partner in critical and emerging technologies. So that was a very major political message. And you are identifying artificial intelligence, quantum, cyber, 6G, biotech, semiconductors, defense, space, whole range of technologies that everybody acknowledged are completely going to transform the way we live, the way we work. The other thought behind that was that through co-development of technology, you then lead to a framework of production sharing. some to be done in the US, some to be done in India, and then look at doing sectoral trade facilitation arrangements to deepen the trade partnership, especially if you want to take it to a level of about $300 billion. Now, ISET itself was a big breakthrough from the past. And again, it is the ISET framing and projection that led to 6 US companies announcing investments in India in semiconductors. That led to US authorizing technology transfer, 80% technology transfer for GE 414 engines. And the US said that that level of technology transfer they had not authorized for any other partner, including any NATO partner of the United States. It was because of that that you saw cooperation in space that was not happening earlier. Later this month, if all goes well, I understand an Indian astronaut will be launched into space on board SpaceX, going to International Space Station in partnership with NASA and doing joint research. Again, very soon, NASA, ISRO, powerful synthetic aperture radar satellite, $1.5 billion satellite, is going to be launched. There's an effort to bring the private sector in space from both India and the US together to do more work together. So these are the kind of things that have happened. So given that framing, when I look at trust, from my mind, and I'm sure Sumana will have a lot to add to that, from my mind, a couple of things emerged. One, that now the new administration has ownership for that process. Yes. And therefore, they would be committed to advancing cooperation in many of these areas. And as I understand it, there is a commitment to further intensify the technology partnership in these and related areas, and also ease the processes related to allowing technology partnerships. Because the export control regulations in the US need to be addressed. They can be very, very onerous for US partners. So while technology partnership is encouraged, what do you do to deal with the regulations related to technology would be an important area. In ISET, they had started the strategic trade dialogue, which had met and to see how to ease some of the processes. And that is something that needs to be done even more. So I would say, yes, trust is ISET plus.
That was my thinking as well. Sumona?
Thank you. So I'll just add a little bit, picking up on a couple of the points that Arun made. First, the fact when ISET was conceived, it was announced in May 2022, launched by the respective national security advisors in January 2023. But before that, you know, I was in the Biden White House at the time. It was not a foregone conclusion that it would be led by the national security advisors. We thought about whether it could be run out of a department or agency. We thought about the various topics that would fall under the dialogue, and most of all, the objective, to really advance the technology partnership in multiple ways across multiple areas. And so the decision was taken and the proposal was made to do it at the level of the national security advisors. And I'm very pleased to see that that will continue in the Trump administration. I think that signifies that leaders will pay attention to the technology partnership. I think it will help activate our respective systems as needed to really achieve results. And overall, I think it's a very positive development for the US-India relationship.
And Nisha, before you answer, this is for any of you, on the technology topic, any thoughts about AI and LLMs being developed by the two countries, or in cooperation between the two countries? Go ahead, Nisha.
Yeah, I think that that's a really excellent question. I was just in New Delhi recently at the Global Technology Summit that's hosted by Carnegie and MEA, and a lot of conversation there about the impact of DeepSeek and the extent to which DeepSeek is being utilized increasingly by businesses across India, and what are the implications of that. And I think, you know, the challenge to both India and the United States is, to what extent can US-India collaboration create alternatives that are cost-effective and that are providing kind of the capabilities and the efficiencies that are necessary, right? And some of the points that, you know, I thought were incredibly insightful that I heard around the conference. You know, government has to be an enabler of technology and not necessarily always the regulator. And in India, there's an overregulation that inhibits innovation. And particularly in the nascent stages, you really need to be in the what can you do to invest in, enable, and allow innovation to scale rapidly before you get your kind of, hooks on what do we do to regulate against negative impacts or whatnot, because otherwise innovation will never get off the ground.
Sanjeev, since you encouraged us to be conversational, could I just make 2 points in response to what Nisha and Sumona have said? On Nisha's point, when you go to Bangalore, you realize that there is deep integration between the tech ecosystem of Bengaluru and of Silicon Valley in artificial intelligence. Core technologies so far are with US companies, including the large language models. But there is tremendous amount of application development happening in India using those technologies. And both sides gain from that. And the US companies I've heard them say that by the work being done through applications on what they have done, they learn how to advance their technologies further, the problems that are there, the opportunities that are there. So both are gaining from that. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. Second thing, based on what Sumona said, is one of the things in the ICET framework, which is also continuing in trust, is it's not just a government-to-government initiative. There's a deliberate effort to involve the private sector and academia in that process. Because especially in the US, the technology is in the private sector. It's at the level of universities. So that partnership is critical. And when the conversations were going on, and I'll cite just one example where it was felt that it would be critical. If you just look at quantum technologies, from what one hears, even the universities don't know fully what to teach that would be relevant to industry. And many of the leading US companies are funding IITs in India to do teaching of quantum so that people are trained who would be available for them later as they expand their operations globally. So this is a clear opportunity for conversation between industry on both sides and universities on both sides. That how do you work together to develop syllabi that would be relevant to industry for use related to quantum technologies, and that would deepen partnership between India and the US in quantum. So I think that's the broad approach, that there should be dialogue at level government, dialogue at the level of industry, academia, and all three working together. And since these are critical technologies, academia and business need clear signal from the governments that they are encouraging cooperation in this area and they would not clamp down on it down the line.
That goes to what Nisha was saying as well. Indiaspora, where I work, recently held a global AI summit in the UAE, and we talked about AI collaboration between the UAE and India, UAE and United States, and to some extent trilaterally as well. And it was quite clear that the UAE is going full steam ahead on AI as far as their own domestic regulations are concerned, but also in terms of their investments in the American AI market. Now, of course, I do understand that India doesn't have a sovereign wealth fund and so forth like the UAE does. So in India, the equation is a little different. You can't necessarily, announce tomorrow that you're going to invest $100 billion in Stargate, for example, kind of thing, which the UAE has done. But I have no hesitation in revealing my biases where I say that, I do hope that the cooperation between India and the United States on AI does deepen as we move forward, which I think, based on comments here, we do expect it will. Sumona?
I think you can expect the cooperation to deepen. I think you have seen high-level signals, again, coming out of the February visit by Prime Minister Modi and the statement that resulted from his visit with President Trump that the US and India have agreed to work on an AI roadmap to really flesh out areas of cooperation, as Arun said, that inherently involve the private sector and academia. One question that the two sides are probably in conversation about, will need to be in conversation about, is the AI diffusion rule. And how far can the two sides go to make India a home for critical AI infrastructure?
uh, I do want to turn the conversation to another topic that I think is extremely germane to where we are today, which is education. And I know that we have limited time left, so after this, I'll try and open it up to the audience if I can. But on education, this conference itself is an example of US-India collaboration on education, the Gupta-Klinsky Institute that I just mentioned when we started out. There are so many universities in America that are at the moment trying to collaborate with educational institutions in India. The reverse is also true, interest in the reverse direction. Where do you see, given that in the past there has been skepticism about deepening cooperation in the education space, do you see education cooperation deepening at a level that is perhaps just below the Ivy Leagues and the top tier schools that are sort of household names all across India and America? Any of you?
Yeah, I think this is a real gem of an opportunity right now. India should be thinking about the fact that if indeed there is going to be a rethinking, restructuring of education and the nexus between government and education in the United States, does that create an opportunity for India to become perhaps a magnet, a hub on higher education, right? Can it draw investment? I think U.S. universities are very interested in opportunities to maybe create satellite campuses, to create collaborations, to create some kinds of joint initiatives, joint ventures with India. India's going to need to figure out, again, how it gets out of its own way in attracting that. I think you're going to need to look at tax issues. You're going to, look at regulatory issues, FICRA, all kinds of things in India that inhibit collaboration. But if those can be moved aside, then as U.S. universities grapple with, perhaps cuts in funding, perhaps cuts in foreign student enrollment, they're looking at where they turn. I think you're hearing Europeans, Australians, Canadians, and others vie for talent and investment on that front. India has a real opportunity, but it needs to act fast, and it needs to act decisively in terms of how it's going to deregulate some of these issues that have prevented education collaboration from taking off.
Given the perception of the visa problems here in the United States, is the United States even the only option for Indian universities to collaborate with? You referenced Australia, England, other countries.
I mean, look, there's a real opportunity as we think about an innovation ecosystem to partner with U.S. universities that have been the backbone of the innovation ecosystem here in the United States. Whether you're talking about the tech sector, you're talking about, pharmaceutical and healthcare innovations, across the board. How do you take collaborations with some of these institutions and perhaps change the geography?
Also, Sanjeev, in the new education policy that the Indian government has announced, now there is provision for foreign universities to set up campuses in India. I think many of the universities are looking at that cautiously because it's new. They're trying to make sure that the kind of regulatory challenge that may come up, they're in a position to navigate that. But some universities, including from Australia, have announced that they are setting up campuses. And I see reports saying some US universities are also actively looking at that. So let's see. I think these conversations should continue, conversations between universities who are interested, the Indian government, and work their way through this.
Fantastic. How much time do we have left? We have 5 minutes left. Okay. So can we open it up to the audience now? Are there microphones for the audience that are roving mics? Or I can provide mine as well. I think Purnima.
There's two mics on either side up there.
Oh, there are mics upstairs, but I think Purnima, I'll just provide you with mine quickly. Identify yourself, please, and your affiliation, and then pose a question to any of the panelists.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Purnima Warrior, founder and CEO of National US-India Chamber of Commerce, promoting trade between United States and India. My question is to the ambassador. Ambassador Arun Singh, we have known you for a while now. You have channelized a lot of things, especially MBDA agency, where you invited them to the embassy, 100 MBEs, which is $1.3 trillion economy of US. My question is on the ports. I'm very concerned about the ports being either stagnant or losing all their containers coming from China and other parts of the world. Ports are affected almost out of, if Los Angeles had about 42% of the port activity, it's coming down next week to 33%. From almost 33% is minusing from there. This is a concern even for state of Washington. It's a $21 billion opportunity with when it comes to port and maritime. Across the board, whether it's Los Angeles, whether it's Washington State, where there are many ports, Port of Seattle, Port of Everett, all of these are being affected. What do you think, will India be able to take over this magnanimous opportunity, and how soon? Thank you.
I haven't seen publicly any comment or thinking in India in terms of port activity in the US, although Indian companies have taken a lease on ports outside India. For example, Haifa port is currently being operated, part of the Haifa port, by an Indian company. So that is certainly there. But the focus in India more is in terms of infrastructure, including at ports in India itself. And new connectivity projects are being looked at. You would have heard about the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. And there's a lot of attention being paid to that, to build connectivity from India to the Gulf, from Gulf on to Israel, and then from Israel to Europe. So that is certainly getting a lot of attention. So I think those are the things being focused upon.
Before we go to a second question, Arun, I'll go forward on that IMEC piece that you just mentioned, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. I was speaking to a senior Indian diplomat, just yesterday, and he was mentioning that because IMEC is conceptual, although India and America are both strongly for it, it is still in a relatively conceptual stage, number one. And number two, given the problems in the Middle East, there may be challenges about really expanding activity along the IMEC corridor for now. Any thoughts?
So I'm sure this will come in, but from my perspective, I think it's gone beyond the conceptual. There is a lot of work going on between enhancing connectivity between India and the Gulf. Also between Israel and Europe. And there's interest from Greece, there's interest from Italy, there's interest from France. India has just opened a consulate in Marseille.
An IMEC envoy as well, the only country to have an IMEC envoy reporting to the president.
India has just opened a consulate general in Marseille, and guess who inaugurated the consulate general? The President of France and the Prime Minister of India. So obviously it's significant. So yes, there is a gap about the connectivity between Gulf and Israel. And so that's what everybody is working on, how to take that forward. But yeah, and especially if India and EU do a free trade agreement, and India and UK have done one. If India and US would do a free trade agreement soon, then you are looking at far more movement of goods, and you need routes, additional routes beyond what you have through the Red Sea and others. So I do see huge opportunities. Sorry.
Any other comments on that? Okay. Another question, please. I see a question right here in the middle. I think there are microphones somewhere in the, there. Oh, there's a gentleman already at the microphone. So first you and then the gentleman here. Wrap up? Just one question. I think the distinguished ambassador from India to the United States is here. So we'll cut it short and have just one last question, please. Sorry about that. Yeah? Please go ahead.
Sanjeev Narayan, Stanford University. I've really enjoyed the Gupta's Institute hosting of this event and the panel. I had a question about this sort of tension between regulation and innovation. Not all regulation stifles innovation. Some may, when it puts barriers, but there's also regulations on, say, data privacy, security of participants, particularly for AI. Could the panel discuss that from an India perspective? What regulations could be put in place moving forwards which would facilitate and yet strengthen dynamic interchanges between the US and India?
I'm happy to start. It's I mean, you make a great point. Governments do need to be involved, and they do need to regulate, and they do need to prevent excesses that could harm their own populations. But it's a very dynamic conversation, and I think the fact that the U.S. and India are engaged at very both high levels from a political perspective, but also bringing in technical experts from across their respective governments to grapple with these issues. The United States doesn't have all the answers, but the fact that it's in this deep conversation with a trusted partner like India will probably mean that they will end up seeing eye to eye as these issues get resolved.
With that, I think we'll end this panel, and Arun, maybe it's time for you to say hello to a successor. So please join me, friends, in giving the panel a very, very big hand.